Please don't send me back. They say you keep people safe.
I won't, I promise.
She wasn't trembling. That was what stopped him. Any other 6-year-old, standing barefoot in a downpour, wet braided puffs clinging to her neck, a soaked red dress sticking to her small frame, would have been hysterical, sobbing, or collapsing against the cold stone of the city's most exclusive club. But Sariyah Knox just stood there. A worn brown teddy bear clutched tightly against her chest, the rain washing over her terrified, pleading eyes. And she looked up at him as if she were staring at the edge of the world, asking one last time because there were no other doors left to knock on. "Please don't send me back," she whispered, her voice barely a thread in the wind. "They said you were the man who keeps people safe." Choi Jae-hoon had walked out of those golden doors tonight with the blood of a finished negotiation on his hands. He had a syndicate to stabilize, a rival family to dismantle, and 2 of the most lethal bodyguards in the city waiting for him to give the signal for the night's executions. He looked at the girl. Then he looked at his lead security detail, the man whose boots were inches away from her small, bare feet, ready to usher the nuisance into the shadows. The guard stepped back, his hand dropping to his side. The sudden, sharp intensity in Jae-hoon's eyes had already communicated the death sentence for anyone who touched her. Slowly, Jae-hoon lowered himself, his expensive trousers soaking up the rainwater as he knelt on the pavement. Behind him, the 2 giants in dark suits stood like statues in the rain, paralyzed because in 10 years of service, they had never seen the boss bow his head. Not for kings, not for gods. As he reached out, the movement shifted his collar, revealing the dark ink of the tattoo on his neck. Sariyah's breath hitched. She recognized the pattern from a story told 5 years ago, a story about a debt that was finally coming due. Jae-hoon didn't see a child, he saw a ghost he owed his life to. "I'm not sending you anywhere," he said, his voice a low, dangerous promise. "You're with me now." The elevator was a cage of gold and glass that didn't just move, it breathed. As the doors hissed shut, sealing out the freezing Chicago rain and the low, rhythmic idling of the black SUVs, the silence became absolute. Sariyah stood in the center of the plush, silk-carpeted floor, her small, bare feet sinking into the pile. She looked like a drop of blood on a fresh shroud, her red dress still weeping water onto the expensive fabric. She didn't move. She didn't even look at the mirrored walls. Her focus remained entirely on the brown teddy bear in her arms, her knuckles white as she squeezed its matted fur. Choi Jae-hoon stood beside her, his presence a towering shadow. He didn't offer a hand, and he didn't speak. He understood that to a creature used to being hunted, a sudden gesture was just another word for a trap. He simply watched the floor numbers climb in the reflection. Behind them, his 2 bodyguards, men who usually filled a room with the scent of gun oil and cold intent, stood unnervingly still. They were looking at the girl's reflection, at the way her braided puffs were drooping with the weight of the storm, and the way her lower lip remained clamped tight to stop the shivering. When the doors slid open at the summit of the building, the obsidian penthouse revealed itself. It was a cathedral of steel, marble, and floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked a city of flickering amber lights. To Jae-hoon, it was a fortress of efficiency. To Sariyah, it was a world that didn't seem to know that hunger or rain existed. "Walk," Jae-hoon said softly. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation to the first safe ground she had ever stepped on. She stepped out tentatively, her toes curling against the heated marble floors. The warmth seemed to startle her. She stopped at the edge of a living area larger than the entire shelter she had fled 2 days ago. Her eyes traveled upward to the vaulted ceilings, then out toward the skyline. "Is this the sky?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's close enough," Jae-hoon replied. He shed his soaked suit jacket, tossing it onto a chair worth more than the car that had brought them here. He signaled to one of the men. "Tell Chef Cho, rice porridge, warm, not hot, and find whatever silk blankets are in the guest wing." Sariyah didn't follow the men with her eyes. She was staring at a glass coffee table, her reflection staring back at her from the dark surface. She looked small, painfully, impossibly small, against the backdrop of Jae-hoon's empire. She turned to him then, her eyes searching his face for the dragon she had seen in the rain. "Am I allowed to sit?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread. The lady at the home said, "I leave spots on things." Jae-hoon looked at the millions of dollars of custom-made furniture, the white Italian leather and the priceless art. Then he looked at the shivering girl in the ruined red dress. "In this house," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant rumble, "there is nothing you can break that cannot be replaced." "But you," he paused, his sharp, intense face softening by a fraction of a millimeter. "You cannot be replaced. Sit wherever you like, Sariyah." She chose the very edge of the largest sofa, huddling into a ball with her bear. As the warmth of the penthouse began to seep into her bones, her eyes began to droop, but she fought it. In her world, closing your eyes was a luxury that cost too much. She watched the man with the tattoo, waiting for the moment the dream would dissolve back into the rain. The first few days in the penthouse were marked by a silence so heavy it felt structural. Sariyah moved through the vast, open spaces like a ghost trying not to disturb the air. She didn't ask for toys, she didn't ask for the television, and she never asked for more than was put in front of her. But Jae-hoon, a man whose survival had always depended on noticing the smallest deviation in a person's shadow, began to see the cracks in her quietude. It started at the dining table. Chef Cho had prepared a simple spread, bowls of steamed white rice, mild soup, and small rolls of fresh bread. Sariyah ate with a mechanical efficiency that was unsettling for a 6-year-old. She didn't savor the warmth. She consumed it as if she were fueling an engine for a long journey. Jae-hoon sat across from her, a glass of dark tea in his hand, his sharp eyes tracking the way her small hand darted toward the breadbasket. She didn't take a bite. Instead, with a practiced, lightning-fast motion, she slid a roll into the pocket of her new silk pajamas. Her eyes flicked up to his, wide and glazed with a sudden, sharp terror. When he didn't move, she did it again with a second piece, her small shoulders hunching forward as if to shield her prize. Later that evening, after the penthouse had settled into its midnight hum, Jae-hoon walked past the guest suite. He didn't enter. He had learned that the clicking of a door handle made her bolt upright, but he watched through the sliver of the door left intentionally ajar. Sariyah wasn't sleeping. She was sitting on the floor in the narrow gap between the bed and the wall, the brown teddy bear tucked under her chin. In front of her, lined up with surgical precision on a discarded napkin, were 4 rolls of bread and 3 individual packets of sugar she must have scavenged from the kitchen earlier. She wasn't eating them. She was just staring at them, her fingers occasionally reaching out to touch the crusts, verifying they were still real. The sight hit Jae-hoon with more force than any physical blow he had ever traded in the alleys of Seoul. He recognized that look. It was the look of a soldier who knew the supply lines had been cut. It was the frantic, quiet calculation of someone who didn't believe in tomorrow. He stepped into the room, his shadow lengthening across the marble floor. Sariyah scrambled to cover the bread with her small hands, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words trembling. "I'll put them back. Please don't send me back. I'll be good." Jae-hoon didn't tower over her. He sank to one knee, the movement fluid and heavy. He looked at the meager hoard, the dry bread that would be stale by morning, and then at the child who thought she had to steal to survive the night in a home that cost millions. "Sariyah," he said, his voice a low, grounded anchor in her storm of panic. "Look at me." She looked up, her braids messy from the day, her eyes swimming. "The kitchen downstairs is never locked," he said. "The bread will be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until you are bored of the taste of it." He reached out, not to take the food, but to place a heavy, protective hand on the floor near her. "You don't have to carry the weight of next week anymore. You only have to carry the bear." She looked at the bread, then back at him, her fingers slowly uncurling from the stolen rolls. She didn't quite believe him. Trauma doesn't yield to a single promise. But for the first time, she didn't try to hide the food. She simply leaned her head against the wall, exhausted by the effort of being hungry in a house of plenty. The transformation of the penthouse didn't happen with a renovation, but with the appearance of a single plastic tea set and a pile of velvet cushions in the center of the reinforced glass sunroom. It was a space designed for strategic oversight, a room where Jae-hoon usually mapped out the movements of his rivals, but now it had been annexed. Di-hyun and Min-ho, two men who collectively represented 40 years of specialized violence and unspoken secrets, stood at the threshold of the sunroom. They were dressed in their usual charcoal suits, their earpieces humming with the chatter of the building's security perimeter. They looked at Jae-hoon, seeking an exit strategy. Jae-hoon merely leaned against the doorframe, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate coils of the dragon on his forearm. He didn't say a word. He simply gestured toward the floor. Where Sariyah sat, her braids neatly redone with small gold beads that caught the afternoon light. "Sit," Sariyah said. It wasn't a plea this time. It was the quiet, absolute authority of a child who had finally found a corner of the world she was allowed to govern. "The tea is getting cold, and Mr. Bear says the big one is being rude by standing." Min-ho, a man whose knuckles were permanently scarred from the docks of Incheon, looked at the tiny, translucent blue cup being held out to him. He glanced at Jae-hoon, who offered a microscopic nod of amusement. Slowly, with a groan of joints that were more used to tactical crouching than domestic play, the two giants lowered themselves onto the silk pillows. They looked absurd, two mountains of muscle and ballistic nylon surrounding a small girl in a sun-drenched room. "It's barley tea," Sariyah explained, carefully pouring imaginary liquid into their cups. "It makes your heart go quiet. That's what Mama used to say." Dae-hyun picked up his cup with two fingers, his pinky extended with unintentional comedy. He took a phantom sip, his face remaining a mask of professional stoicism. "It is very flavorful, Miss Sariyah," he rumbled, his voice like gravel being turned in a mixer. "You have a dragon too," Sariyah noted, pointing to the ink peeking out from Dae-hyun's cuff. She turned to look at Jae-hoon, then back at the bodyguards. "Are you all dragons? Is that why you stay together?" The air in the room shifted. It was a question that pierced through the layers of their profession. They weren't just security, they were a brotherhood forged in the fire of the underworld. But to her, they were simply a family of mythical creatures meant to stand guard. "We are," Min-ho replied, his voice softening. "We guard the horde." "I'm not a horde," Sariyah giggled, the sound light and unexpected like a bell ringing in a tomb. "I'm just Sariyah." "Same thing," Jae-hoon intervened from the doorway. For the next hour, the obsidian penthouse was not a headquarters for a criminal syndicate. It was a tea house. The bodyguards learned the proper way to hold a stuffed bear and the exact amount of imaginary sugar required for a perfect cup of tea. They watched the way Sariyah's small hands moved without trembling, noticing that for the first time, she wasn't looking at the door to see if someone was coming to take her away. By the time the sun began to dip below the Chicago skyline, the fearsome giants were leaning back against the glass, their guards lowered by a 6-year-old's hospitality. They had entered as shadows, but as Sariyah leaned against Min-ho's massive shoulder to show him a drawing, they had become something else entirely, a wall of bone and spirit that no army could ever hope to breach. The city outside was a blurred mosaic of neon and rain, but inside the study, the world narrowed to the diameter of a small silver circle. Jae-hoon sat at his desk, the heavy mahogany surface scattered with watchmaker's tools, precision tweezers, a jeweler's loop, and a vial of silver solder. In the center of the green felt mat lay the broken pendant Sariyah had carried in the pocket of her red dress like a holy relic. It was a simple thing, a locket shaped like a lotus, its hinge crushed and its chain snapped into 3 jagged segments. To anyone else, it was scrap metal. To Jae-hoon, it was the physical manifestation of a debt that had been compounding interest for 60 months. He picked up the magnifying loupe, his steady hands that had dismantled empires and held the cold weight of steel, moving with a tenderness that would have terrified his enemies. As he aligned the delicate silver links, the smell of the rain hitting the glass balcony triggered a memory he usually kept locked in the dark basement of his mind. 5 years ago, a different storm. He remembered the alleyway in the south side, the copper tang of his own blood in his mouth, and the sound of boots hitting the pavement behind him. He had been young, arrogant, and cornered. He remembered the woman who had appeared from a doorway, a woman with the same defiant, quiet eyes as Sariyah. She hadn't known who he was, only that he was being hunted. She had shoved him behind a stack of crates and stood her ground against men who looked like nightmares. She had paid for his life with her own, leaving him with nothing but a blurred memory of a lotus pendant and a promise whispered into the dark. "Find my girl. Tell her the dragon will come." The solder sparked under the torch, a tiny star of heat in the dim room. Jae-hoon worked with a focused intensity, fusing the silver back together, erasing the scars of 5 years of neglect. He wasn't just fixing a piece of jewelry. He was repairing the bridge between a dead woman's sacrifice and a living child's future. A soft scuff of fabric against the carpet made him pause. He didn't turn around. He knew the weight of her footsteps now, light, hesitant, always measuring the distance to the nearest exit. "Is it dead?" Sariyah whispered from the doorway, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. "Items don't die, Sariyah," Jae-hoon said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "They just wait to be remembered." He set the tools down and turned in his chair. The pendant hung from his finger, the silver gleaming under the desk lamp, the lotus petals perfectly aligned once more. The chain was whole, a continuous circle of protection. Sariyah approached, her eyes widening as she recognized the object. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches away, afraid to touch something that looked so new. "Mama said it was broken because the world was broken," she said softly. Jae-hoon leaned forward, his sharp face illuminated by the lamp, the dragon on his neck appearing to shift in the shadows. He reached out and draped the cool silver around her neck, clicking the clasp shut with a definitive metallic snap. "The world is still broken," Jae-hoon said, looking her directly in the eye. "But this house is not, and neither is your mother's word." Sariyah touched the lotus, her small thumb tracing the smooth metal. For the first time since she had arrived, the hypervigilance in her expression flickered and died. She didn't say thank you. Instead, she stepped into the space between his knees and leaned her forehead against his chest, a silent acknowledgement that the 60-month debt had finally been settled, and a new, much deeper one had begun. The penthouse was usually a cathedral of silence at 3 in the morning, a place where the city's distant hum was filtered through layers of reinforced glass and expensive isolation. But tonight, the stillness was fractured. It wasn't a loud sound, not the crash of a break-in or the thunder of a gunshot, but a sharp, rhythmic whimpering that cut through the shadows of the hallway. Jae-hoon was awake before the third cry reached his door. He moved through the darkness with a predator's grace, his silk shirt unbuttoned, the dragon on his chest appearing to coil and stretch in the dim glow of the floor lights. He didn't hesitate at the door to the guest wing. He pushed it open to find a scene that no amount of money or security could prevent. Sariyah was tangled in the emerald silk sheets, her small body thrashing against an invisible weight. The silver lotus pendant caught the moonlight, dancing frantically against her throat. She wasn't screaming words. She was making the sound of someone drowning in air. The brown teddy bear had been kicked to the floor, forgotten in the grip of a memory that was clearly louder than the present. "Sariyah," Jae-hoon said, his voice low and firm, grounding the room. She didn't hear him. Her eyes were snapped shut, her small hands clawing at the air as if trying to push back a closing door. "No," she gasped. The word broken by a sob. "Don't let them, please. I'll be quiet. I'll be so quiet." Jae-hoon sat on the edge of the bed. He knew better than to grab her. He had seen enough men wake up from the horrors of war to know that a sudden touch was often interpreted as an attack. Instead, he began to hum. It was a low, vibrational sound, a melody his own mother had hummed in a small kitchen in Busan a lifetime ago, before the world had turned him into a weapon. As the vibration filled the space, Sariyah's thrashing slowed. Her eyes flew open, wide and glazed with the lingering fog of the nightmare. For a heartbeat, she didn't see the penthouse or the man with the tattoo. She saw the shadows of the foster home, the cold floors, and the faces of people who saw her as a line item in a ledger. "It's the rain, Sariyah," Jae-hoon murmured, his hand resting flat on the mattress near her, offering a boundary but not a restraint. "Just the rain on the glass. Nothing is coming through those doors." She stared at him, her breath hitching in jagged, painful intervals. Slowly, the recognition returned. She saw the sharp line of his jaw, the attentive stillness of his gaze, and the way he occupied the room like an unbreakable shield. The terror in her expression began to melt into an exhausted, raw vulnerability. She crawled toward him, her movements shaky and uncoordinated, until she collapsed against his side. She tucked her head into the crook of his arm, her small face pressing against the ink of the dragon on his chest. Jae-hoon went rigid for a second. Physical affection was a language he had forgotten how to speak, but then his arms settled around her, a heavy, protective weight. "You're safe," he said into the quiet. "The debt is paid. The doors are locked." Sariyah let out a long, shuddering breath, her fingers curling into his shirt. She was drifting back toward a different kind of sleep now, one fueled by exhaustion rather than fear. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice muffled against his skin. "Stay, Appa." The word hit Jae-hoon with the force of a physical impact, vibrating through his ribs and settling deep in his chest. It was a title he hadn't earned, a word reserved for a different kind of man. But as he looked down at the child who had finally stopped trembling in his arms, he realized the syndicate boss who had walked into the rain that first night was gone. In his place was a man who realized that some territories were worth more than others. He didn't correct her. He simply pulled the silk blanket over her shoulders and stayed in the dark, watching the door until the sun began to bleed over the horizon. The high-altitude silence of the penthouse was usually a sanctuary, but tonight it felt like a pressurized chamber. While Sariyah slept the deep, heavy sleep of a child who finally believed the doors were locked, Jae-hoon sat in the glow of 6 monitors in his private command center. The blue light cast sharp, jagged shadows across his face, making the dragon on his neck appear to shift and coil with every breath. Across from him sat Juno, his lead data specialist, a man who dealt in the digital ghosts of the city's most powerful people. Juno didn't look up from his keyboard. "It's not just a foster agency, boss," he murmured, his voice tight with a rare, cold edge. "It's a clearinghouse." On the center screen, a photograph of Vance appeared. He was a man of expensive dental work and tailored suits, the kind of professional who stood at charity galas holding champagne while talking about the future of our youth. But as Juno scrolled through the encrypted subfolders of Vance's private server, a different architecture emerged. Vance wasn't just managing a state contract. He was a logistics manager for the Baekho clan. The pipeline, as they called it, was a sophisticated network that moved children like Sariyah across state lines before they could be flagged by the system. They were treated as high-value inventory, untouchable because Vance provided the legal cover and the Baekho provided the muscle. Sariyah wasn't just lost, Jae-hoon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, resonant register. She was a leak in their ledger. "Exactly," Juno replied, pulling up a scanned document. "Vance flagged her as unrecoverable 3 days ago. That's why he's panicking. He didn't just lose a child. He lost a piece of evidence that links his state-funded agency to the Baekho's human trafficking roots. If she talks, or if someone with enough weight looks into her history, the whole pipeline collapses." Jae-hoon leaned forward, his eyes scanning a spreadsheet that detailed the maintenance costs of dozens of children. Next to Sariyah's name was a red notation: "Eliminate discrepancy." The realization hit Jae-hoon with a cold, surgical clarity. The men he had been fighting for years over territory and drug routes were the same men who had been hunting the small girl currently clutching a teddy bear in the next room. To the Baekho, Sariyah was a liability. To Vance, she was a mistake that needed to be erased to protect his pension and his prestige. "They think they're playing a game of numbers," Jae-hoon whispered, his hand tightening around a heavy glass paperweight until his knuckles turned white. "They've already sent out a recovery team," Juno added, his fingers flying across the keys. "They're tracking the biometric data from the shelter she fled. They don't know she's here yet, boss. They think she's still on the street." "Let them keep looking at the street," Jae-hoon said, standing up. The movement was fluid, the predatory grace of a man who had stopped calculating the cost of war. "They've spent years building a pipeline made of shadows and fine print. They think they're safe because they have the law in one pocket and a syndicate in the other." He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the sprawling, indifferent lights of Chicago. Somewhere out there, Marcus Vance was sleeping in a bed bought with the lives of children who had no one to kneel for them. But they forgot one thing, Jae-hoon murmured, his reflection in the glass looking back at him with eyes that had seen the bottom of the world. A dragon doesn't care about the law, and a father doesn't care about the odds. "What are the orders, boss?" Juno asked. Jae-hoon didn't turn around. "Burn the pipeline, start with the paper trail, and I'll handle the shadows. By morning, I want Marcus Vance to realize that the discrepancy he tried to eliminate is the only thing currently keeping him alive." The storm outside had transitioned from a drizzle to a rhythmic lashing against the glass, masking the sound of the first security perimeter being breached. Inside the obsidian penthouse, the air was warm and smelled of the barley tea Sariyah had insisted on making for the night watch. Sariyah was asleep in the sunken living area, her head resting on a velvet cushion and her fingers entwined with the silver lotus pendant. Jae-hoon sat in a nearby armchair, a book open but unread in his lap. He wasn't looking at the pages. He was watching the way the shadows moved in the hallway. The breach didn't start with an explosion. It started with the sudden, eerie silence of the elevators being cut and the flickering of the floor lights as the backup generators struggled to kick in. Di-hyun appeared in the doorway, his hand already inside his jacket. His face was a mask of cold, professional clarity. "The service stairs," he whispered. "Baekho clan. They didn't come for a negotiation, boss." Jae-hoon stood up. He didn't look panicked. He looked like a man who had finally been given permission to stop being polite. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, scooping Sariyah up before she could even process the transition from dream to reality. "Appa," she murmured, her eyes fluttering open, wide and dark with a sudden instinctual fear. "Close your eyes, Sariyah," Jae-hoon said, his voice a low, vibrating hum against her ear. "We're going to the vault. It's a game of hide and seek. You stay until I come for you. Do you understand?" He reached the end of the corridor and pressed his palm against a seamless mahogany panel. The wall slid back to reveal a small, reinforced room, the dragon's vault, lined with monitors and oxygen supplies. He placed her on a chair and handed her the brown teddy bear. "Stay quiet as a mouse," he whispered, kissing her forehead. As the steel door hissed shut, the penthouse erupted. The glass of the balcony shattered as 3 men swung in on tactical ropes. The sound was like 1,000 crystal bells breaking at once. They were fast, armed with silenced submachine guns and the arrogance of men who thought a businessman lived here. They didn't realize that Jae-hoon had been a wolf long before he had been a boss. The living room became a blur of high-stakes violence. Jae-hoon moved through the shadows of his own home like a vengeful ghost. He didn't use a gun, he used the environment. A heavy glass vase became a projectile, a designer chair became a shield. He intercepted the first man with a strike so precise it collapsed the interloper's windpipe before he could squeeze the trigger. "Where is the girl?" one of the intruders barked, his voice echoing off the marble. Jae-hoon stepped into the light of the flickering chandelier. His white shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing the full, coiled length of the dragon tattoo. His eyes weren't just angry, they were void of any mercy. "You entered the wrong house," Jae-hoon said, his voice a low, terrifying growl that seemed to come from the floorboards themselves. "Nobody takes what's mine." He moved with a speed that defied his size. He was a whirlwind of lethal efficiency, a man reclaiming his nature to protect his future. Within minutes, the penthouse was silent again, save for the rain whistling through the broken glass and the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors who realized too late that they had hunted the wrong prey. When the last of the Baekho team lay motionless on the Italian tile, Jae-hoon didn't check his wounds. He walked straight to the vault. He wiped the blood from his hand on his trousers before pressing the sensor. The door slid open. Sariyah was sitting exactly where he had left her, her eyes squeezed shut, clutching the bear. "Is the game over?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jae-hoon knelt, the dragon on his neck glistening with sweat and rain. He reached out and pulled her into a crushing embrace. "The game is over," he whispered. "And we won." The office of Marcus Vance was a shrine to the illusion of order, oak paneling, leather-bound books, and a view of the city that suggested he was its architect rather than its scavenger. When the heavy doors swung open, Vance didn't look up from his desk. He was busy adjusting his silk tie in a small silver mirror, preparing for another day of moving inventory through his pipeline. He didn't notice the silence until it was too late. Usually, the hallway outside hummed with the sound of busy assistants and phones. Now, there was only the heavy, rhythmic thud of a single pair of boots. Vance looked up, his rehearsed smile faltering as he saw Choi Jae-hoon standing in the doorway. Behind Jae-hoon, the office was empty. His staff had been cleared out with a single look from the two giants in charcoal suits who now stood guard at the entrance. "Mr. Choi," Vance said, his voice tightening into a thin, professional chord. "I wasn't aware we had an appointment. If this is about the discrepancy from last week, I assure you my team is handling the recovery." Jae-hoon didn't speak. He walked across the room, his presence shrinking the space until the air felt heavy and thin. He placed a single, thick folder on the mahogany desk. It wasn't an invoice or a threat. It was a mirror. "The Baekho clan is finished, Marcus," Jae-hoon said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that lacked any trace of heat. "Their docs were raided an hour ago. Their ledgers, the ones with your signature on the maintenance fees for 32 missing children, are currently being decrypted by people who do not take bribes." Vance's face went the color of ash. He reached for the phone, but his hand began to shake, the silver mirror on his desk reflecting a man who had finally run out of exits. You have no authority here. I am a state contractor. I have protections." "You have paper," Jae-hoon countered, leaning over the desk. The movement shifted his collar, revealing the dark, coiled ink of the dragon. "I have the truth. And right now, the truth is the only thing keeping you from being handed over to the families of those 32 children." Jae-hoon pulled a second document from the folder, a legal petition for the full, irrevocable adoption of Sariyah Knox. He slid a fountain pen across the desk. It was an expensive pen, weighted and cold. "Sign," Jae-hoon commanded. "This is illegal," Vance stammered, his eyes darting toward the door. "You can't just take a ward of the state. There are procedures, background checks." "I have already cleared the background check," Jae-hoon said, a ghost of a smile touching his sharp face. "Associates have ensured that your digital records now show Sariyah was never in your system. She doesn't belong to the state. She doesn't belong to the pipeline. She belongs to a home you will never be allowed to visit." He leaned closer, his eyes pinning Vance to his chair. "You will sign these papers. You will then resign your position due to health concerns. And if I ever see your name associated with a child again, if I even see you walk past a playground, I will remind you why they call me the dragon." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic, scratching sound of Vance's pen against the parchment. He signed his name 3 times, his legacy dissolving with every stroke of ink. Jae-hoon picked up the papers, checking the signatures with surgical precision. He didn't thank the man. He didn't offer a parting word. He simply turned and walked toward the door, the heavy documents tucked under his arm like a shield. As he stepped back into the hallway, the light of the morning sun caught the silver lotus pendant he carried in his pocket, a twin to the one Sariyah wore. The debt was no longer just a memory of a dead woman. It was a living, breathing promise. He wasn't just a boss returning to his tower. He was a father going home to tell his daughter that the world had finally stopped trying to take her back. The penthouse was no longer a fortress of cold marble and strategic silence. It had become a place of afternoons. The Chicago skyline, once a jagged map of territories to be conquered, now served as the backdrop for a life measured in small, quiet victories. 3 months had passed since the night at Marcus Vance's office, and the world had shifted its axis. Sariyah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the vast, shimmering expanse of Lake Michigan. The water was a deep, restless blue, stretching toward an horizon that didn't feel like a threat. She was wearing a soft yellow sweater, the silver lotus pendant resting securely against her collarbone. She no longer moved like a ghost trying to avoid the light. She moved like someone who owned the air she breathed. Jae-hoon sat at the mahogany table behind her, but he wasn't looking at ledgers or surveillance feeds. He was watching Sariyah. He watched the way she didn't flinch when the ice maker. hummed, and the way she didn't check the door when Di-hyun entered the room with a stack of books instead of a weapon. "Is the lake hungry today?" Jae-hoon asked, his voice a low, warm anchor in the room. Sariyah turned, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "No, it's just full," she said, leaning against the glass. "It doesn't have to go anywhere, it just gets to be there." She walked over to him, her steps confident on the heated floors. She didn't look for a place to hide. Instead, she climbed into the chair beside him and opened a picture book about the stars. She still kept a small container of water on the nightstand, and she still tucked a single piece of chocolate under her pillow before sleep. But the frantic, starving edge of her trauma had dulled into a manageable habit. She was learning that in this house, the present tense wasn't a temporary truce. It was a permanent state of being. "Juno said the stars are always there, even when the sun is out," she whispered, tracing a constellation with her finger. "He said they don't leave just because we can't see them." "He's right," Jae-hoon replied, resting his hand near hers. "Some things are constant, like the lake, like this room." He looked at his own hands, hands that had once only known how to take, how to break, and how to hold on to power. Now they were the hands that tied shoelaces and held a book steady while a child learned to read. The syndicate still existed, the dragon tattoo still coiled around his neck, and the world outside was still a dangerous, fractured place. But inside these walls, the navigable hours were filled with the sound of Sariyah humming a song she had made up about a bear and a dragon. The debt to the woman in the rain had been paid in full, but the life that followed was a gift Jae-hoon hadn't known he was allowed to receive. He realized then that he wasn't just guarding a child, he was being healed by one. The shadows of the past, the blood, the debt, and the cold Chicago winters had been pushed back by the steady, quiet light of a girl who finally believed she was wanted. Sariyah leaned her head against his arm, her breath steady and slow. She wasn't looking at the exit. She wasn't calculating the cost of her stay. She was simply there in the safe, warm center of the present tense. "Stay for the next page, Appa," she asked, not looking up. Jae-hoon turned the page, the movement fluid and peaceful. "I'm staying for all of them, Sariyah, every single one."